There is a country sitting directly in the middle of Hitler's Europe. Surrounded on every side by Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and occupied France. No natural army to speak of compared to its neighbors. No powerful allies coming to save it. By every rule of how the Second World War played out everywhere else, this country should not have survived the war independent and untouched. It did. And for 80 years, the story people have been told is that Switzerland's neutrality saved it, that the Swiss simply declared themselves out of the fight, and the world respected that. But Germany didn't respect anyone else's neutrality. Belgium was neutral. The Netherlands was neutral. Luxembourg and Denmark were neutral. All of them were invaded within days of Germany deciding to move. So why not Switzerland? Hitler hated the Swiss personally, called them a mortal enemy, and had a real invasion plan sitting ready on his generals' desks for over a year. What actually stopped him? And what did surviving the war actually cost the country that pulled it off? By the summer of 1940, France had just fallen. Germany controlled almost the entire western half of continental Europe. Switzerland sat there, surrounded on every side, German territory to the north and east, newly occupied France to the west, Fascist Italy, Germany's own ally, to the south. There was no path out. No sea to escape across. No neighboring free country to retreat into. And Switzerland's military, on paper, was nothing close to a match. A small, mostly citizen soldier force, no serious air power, no offensive capability whatsoever. If Germany had wanted to take it, most historians agree the outcome of a direct fight was never really in doubt. Yet Switzerland ended the war exactly as it started it, independent, unoccupied, its government intact, its borders unchanged. In a Europe where nearly every small nation in Germany's path was crushed, occupied, or annexed, Switzerland is one of the very few exceptions. Switzerland's neutrality wasn't a World War II invention. It traces back to 1515, to a brutal defeat at the Battle of Marignano, after which the Swiss made a defining national decision. Never again would they seek out a fight beyond their own borders. Over the following centuries, that policy of armed neutrality became something close to a national identity. The Swiss wouldn't attack anyone, but they would defend themselves with everything they had if attacked. By the 20th century, this had become codified into international law itself, through the 1907 Hague Conventions, which spelled out exactly what a neutral country was and wasn't allowed to do. No participating in armed conflict, no letting warring nations use its territory, and crucially, an obligation to treat all sides equally in trade, regardless of who was fighting whom. By the time Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, Switzerland wasn't waiting to find out what would happen. Within 2 days, 3 full Swiss Army Corps had already deployed along the country's eastern, northern, and western borders. This wasn't a country hoping neutrality alone would be enough. It was preparing, immediately, for the possibility that it wouldn't be. The centerpiece of that preparation was a plan built around Switzerland's greatest natural asset, its mountains. Swiss General Henri Guisan built a defense strategy known as the National Redoubt, instead of trying to hold the flatter, more exposed border regions where German tanks could roll straight through. The plan was to retreat the entire army into pre-fortified positions deep in the Alps. Tunnels. Bunkers. Choke points at mountain passes that an invading force would have to fight through one at a time, at enormous cost, for territory that, militarily, wasn't worth all that much once you actually took it. Germany did draw up a real plan to invade. It was called Operation Tannenbaum, Operation Christmas Tree, and it wasn't some vague contingency sitting in a drawer. Planning began in June 1940, immediately after France's surrender, and by October 1940 it had been formally approved. Estimates for the invasion force ran as high as 300,000 to 500,000 combined German and Italian troops. Heinrich Himmler had reportedly already discussed candidates for who would govern occupied Swiss territory once it fell. Hitler's personal feelings toward Switzerland weren't subtle either. He reportedly called it a pimple on the face of Europe and told Mussolini directly that the Swiss were the mortal enemies of the new Germany. Joseph Goebbels called it this stinking little state. This wasn't indifference. This was open hostility, backed by an actual, approved military plan. And yet, the order to actually launch Tannenbaum never came. Here's where the story stops being simple. For decades, the popular version was that Switzerland's mountain defenses and citizen soldier army made the cost of invasion too high to be worth it, that the Alps themselves saved Switzerland. And there's real truth in that. The National Redoubt strategy was specifically designed to make any invasion bloody, slow, and expensive for territory that offered little strategic reward once conquered. but that explanation alone doesn't fully hold up. Germany had already paid enormous costs to invade far larger, far better defended countries. Difficulty alone didn't stop the Wehrmacht anywhere else in Europe. A different explanation, championed by Swiss sociologist and politician Jean Ziegler, cuts closer to something uncomfortable. Hitler was crazy, Ziegler said, but not so crazy as to attack his own banker. Switzerland, while officially neutral, was doing enormous business with Nazi Germany throughout the war, and the scale of that business is almost never taught alongside the story of the mountains and the citizen army. Switzerland controlled something Germany could not do without: the Gotthard and Simplon rail tunnels, the two vital arteries connecting Germany directly to its ally Italy through the Alps. Under a treaty dating back to 1909, Switzerland was actually bound by international agreement to keep the Gotthard line running for exactly this kind of transit traffic. Throughout the war, north to south freight crossing Switzerland between Germany, Italy, and occupied France nearly tripled, rising from about 2.5 million tons a year before the war to almost 6 million tons a year at its wartime peak: coal, raw materials, and industrial goods, flowing exactly where Germany needed them to go. Switzerland also sold Germany something it could never stockpile or import from anywhere else: electricity, generated by its own alpine hydroelectric dams, safely out of reach of Allied bombers. Swiss power exports to Germany ran to roughly 500 million kilowatts annually, around 40% of the entire power supply of southern Germany, and that hydroelectric capacity alone produced some 16,000 tons of aluminum for German industry every year of the war. Over the course of the conflict, the electricity Switzerland sold Germany was worth the equivalent of more than 6 million tons of coal. In 1940, Switzerland went further still, agreeing to fold itself into a German-controlled trade system known as the European Central Clearing Arrangement, which gave Germany direct control over how Switzerland traded with occupied nations like the Netherlands, Belgium, Norway, and Poland. A later Swiss government investigation, examining exactly this record decades afterward, didn't shy away from what it meant. Keeping those rail lines open for German transit, the investigators concluded, was an important service rendered to Nazi Germany, one that, alongside war loans that funded Swiss purchases of vital machinery and materials, had in the Commission's own words contravened the law of neutrality Switzerland claimed to be upholding the entire time. Switzerland, in other words, wasn't simply a country Germany chose to leave alone. It was a country plugged directly into Germany's war economy, its rail lines, its electricity, its factories producing precision instruments, fuses, and watches sold to both sides of the war. In this view, Switzerland wasn't spared because it was too tough to conquer. It was spared because it was more valuable to Nazi Germany intact, functioning, and quietly cooperative than it would have been as another occupied territory to administer. Just how deep Switzerland's financial relationship with Nazi Germany went wasn't fully understood by the outside world until decades later either, and when it finally came out, it very nearly cost Switzerland its global banking reputation entirely. Throughout the war, the Swiss National Bank purchased Nazi gold directly from Germany's central bank, the Reichsbank, roughly 1.2 billion Swiss francs worth between 1940 and 1945. For years, Switzerland maintained this had simply been ordinary wartime commerce. But the gold wasn't ordinary. A significant portion of it, investigators later determined, had been looted, melted down from the reserves of occupied nations, and in some documented cases, taken directly from Holocaust victims themselves. Swiss authorities, the later investigation concluded, either knew this or should have known it at the time. This stayed buried for half a century. It resurfaced violently in the mid-1990s, when Jewish organizations and the United States government began pressing Swiss banks over another related scandal: dormant accounts. Holocaust victims who had deposited savings in Swiss banks before being murdered had, in many cases, left behind accounts that their surviving families could never access. Swiss banks demanded death certificates that, for people killed in concentration camps, had simply never been issued. In October 1996, a Holocaust survivor named Gisela Weishaus filed the first class action lawsuit in the United States against Swiss banks. More lawsuits followed, accusing Switzerland's largest financial institutions of having been, in effect, chief financiers of the Nazi war machine, laundering stolen wealth for decades after the war ended. The Swiss government, under mounting international pressure, convened its own investigation the same year, the Independent Commission of Experts, chaired by historian Jean-François Bergier, and known ever since as the Bergier Commission. Over 9 years of investigation, the Bergier Commission confirmed nearly everything the accusations alleged. It found Swiss banks had, in the Commission's own words, engaged in what one federal judge later called a conspiracy to stonewall Holocaust survivors and their heirs seeking access to accounts that had, in some documented cases, been improperly transferred to the Nazis. It confirmed the Swiss National Bank's gold purchases from the Reichsbank, and found strong evidence that a meaningful share of that gold had passed through the Swiss financial system despite having been looted from individual victims and occupied central banks. Separately, the Commission also documented that Switzerland had turned away tens of thousands of refugees fleeing Nazi persecution at its own borders during the war, the same border policy that, decades later, would sit uneasily beside Switzerland's public image as a wartime safe haven. Facing sustained international pressure, mounting lawsuits, and the threat of being frozen out of the American banking system entirely, Switzerland's major banks eventually agreed to a settlement of $1.25 billion, one of the largest Holocaust-related financial settlements in history, paid out decades after the war it stemmed from had ended. So the country that avoided invasion by staying quietly useful to a genocidal regime spent the final years of the 20th century paying, publicly and expensively, for exactly how useful it had chosen to be. To this day, historians genuinely disagree on which explanation mattered most for why Switzerland was never invaded in the first place: the mountains, the money, or the timing, since Operation Tannenbaum sat fully approved and ready by late 1940, only for Germany's entire strategic focus to shift violently eastward by June 1941, into the invasion of the Soviet Union. Most agree it was some combination of all three: a country that made itself expensive to fight, valuable to leave alone, and increasingly irrelevant to Germany's shifting priorities at exactly the moment it might otherwise have been invaded. What's clear is that the comfortable national myth, "our neutrality alone protected us," doesn't survive close historical scrutiny, and neither does the myth that survival came without cost. Switzerland's survival wasn't a passive accident of staying out of the fight. It was the product of a country that armed itself to the teeth, made itself deliberately painful to conquer, plugged its rail lines and its power grid directly into Germany's war machine, and then spent 50 years insisting that wasn't what had happened, until the evidence made that position impossible to hold. So why did Hitler never invade Switzerland? Not because he respected its neutrality, he despised the Swiss and had a fully approved plan sitting ready to end it. He held back because a mountain war would have cost him dearly, because Switzerland's rail lines, its electricity, and its banks were quietly worth more to him intact than conquered, and because history handed him a much larger war to fight instead, at exactly the moment it mattered most. And the price of that survival didn't come due in 1945. It came due half a century later, in a New York courtroom, and cost far more than any invasion ever would have. Switzerland wasn't the only small nation to survive the war this way, banking its safety on being more useful alive than dead. There's another country, much smaller, much less well known, that made almost the identical bet during the exact same war, and its story is even stranger. Every claim in this video is independently sourced. If you want more untold stories like this one, subscribe, a new one drops every week.